He didn't hide, didn't threaten. He just said, "You weren't supposed to come." Lenora Whitaker wasn't supposed to be climbing steep mountain trails at her age. At least that's what everyone kept telling her. But the quiet of the ridge called to her in a way nothing else had. Halfway up, her German shepherd, Bruno, froze, then growled low, steady, warning. The cabin above stood still against the cliff. Abandoned, they said. But Bruno wasn't watching the door. He was watching something just beyond it. Lenora Whitaker stopped halfway up the trail, one hand pressed against the rough bark of a pine tree, the other resting on her knee. The climb had been steeper than it looked from below. The kind of steep that didn't show itself until you were already in it. Lungs working harder, legs heavier with every step. She drew in a slow breath. The air was cooler up here, thinner somehow, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and damp earth. It filled her chest, then slipped out again in a quiet exhale. Easy, she murmured, more to herself than anything else. A few yards ahead, Bruno stood still, too still. Lenora noticed it right away. He wasn't sniffing, wasn't pacing, wasn't circling like he usually did when they stopped. His body had gone rigid, tail low but not tucked, ears forward, locked on something. Bruno? He didn't look back. The dog's gaze stayed fixed up the trail. Then it came, a low growl, not loud, not sudden. It rolled out of him slowly, deep in his chest, like something rising from instinct instead of fear. Lenora straightened a little, her breath catching halfway in. "That's enough," she said gently. "What is it?" Bruno didn't move, so. The growl didn't stop either. It held steady, vibrating through the quiet air around them. Lenora followed his line of sight. The trail curved upward another 20 yards before opening into a narrow ridge. Beyond that, just visible through the thinning trees, stood the cabin. It leaned against the cliff like it had been placed there and forgotten. Gray wood, weathered almost silver. The roof dipped slightly in the middle. One side of it pressed into the rock face as if the mountain had claimed part of it back. It looked empty. It always had, from what she'd been told. Lenora squinted, trying to make out any movement. Nothing. No shifting shadows. No flicker of light. Just stillness. The kind that settled deep into a place after years of being left alone. "Probably nothing," she said quietly, but her voice didn't sound convinced. Bruno's growl deepened. Lenora felt it this time, not just hearing it, but sensing it. There was a difference. She had lived long enough with dogs to know that not every growl meant the same thing. This wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement. It was warning. She stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the soft dirt of the trail. Small stones shifted underfoot, rolling just enough to make her cautious. "Stay," she told him. Bruno didn't move. That alone made her pause. He always listened. Even now, at his age, 9, maybe 10, he still followed her voice without question. But this time, he held his ground, muscles tight, head slightly lowered. His eyes hadn't left the ridge. Lenora looked again toward the cabin. Something about the silence felt off. Not empty, just wrong. The wind had dropped, completely. The trees stood still around them, branches frozen, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire mountainside. Even the faint rustle she'd grown used to since starting the climb had disappeared. All she could hear now was her own breathing. And Bruno. A soft, steady growl. She took another step. The trail narrowed here, hugging the slope more tightly. To her right, the ground fell away into a steep drop, thick with dark green trees that swallowed the light. To her left, the rock face rose up, cold and uneven, flecked with patches of moss. "All right," she said under her breath. "We're fine." But she slowed anyway. Bruno finally moved, not forward, back. One careful step at a time until he stood closer to her side, still facing uphill, still watching. "Good boy," she thought. "Stay close." His shoulder brushed lightly against her leg, not seeking comfort, just positioning, protective. Lenora's chest tightened slightly. She reached down without thinking and rested her hand briefly on his back. His fur was warm, thick under her fingers. "You hear something?" she whispered. The dog didn't answer, of course, but his body tensed again. And then, another sound. Faint. So faint she almost missed it. A soft shift, like wood settling under weight. Lenora's head lifted. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Just silence again. She let the breath out slowly, shaking her head. "Old place," she muttered. "Probably just the boards." Still. Her eyes drifted back to the cabin. The door. It looked closed from here. Maybe. Hard to tell with the angle and the shadows gathering around it. She took one more step forward, then another. Bruno didn't growl louder, but he didn't stop either. It stayed there, low and steady, like a line drawn in the air between them and whatever waited above. Lenora swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. She had climbed a long way already, too far to turn around now over a sound she couldn't even explain. Still, she slowed again, her gaze fixed on the ridge, on the cabin. And then she realized something that made her stop completely. Bruno wasn't looking at the door. He wasn't even looking at the windows. His eyes were fixed just to the side of it, toward a darker patch of shadow where the cabin met the cliff. As if something stood there. Lenora's fingers tightened slightly against his fur. "What do you see?" she whispered. The dog didn't answer. He just kept growling. Lenora let her hand fall slowly from Bruno's back. For a moment she didn't move at all. The ridge, the cabin, the silence, it all pressed in on her, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. She glanced down at Bruno again. "All right," she murmured, quieter this time. "We'll take it slow." Her voice sounded steady enough, but inside something had already shifted. She hadn't come all this way expecting this. Not really. The truth was, she hadn't come here expecting anything at all. That had been the whole point. Lenora stepped forward again, carefully placing her foot on the narrow trail. The dirt was loose here, mixed with old pine needles that slid under her boots if she wasn't paying attention. She steadied herself against the rock wall and moved another step up. Bruno stayed close now. Too close for his usual wandering. His shoulder brushed her leg again as he moved, still angled toward the ridge, still watching, still listening. Lenora followed his gaze again, but the cabin hadn't changed. It sat there exactly the same, silent, still, as if it had been empty for years. Like everyone said it was, she drew in another breath, slower this time, and let it out through her nose. People talked. They always had. Back in town, it didn't take long before someone mentioned the cabin. Not directly. Not like a warning. More like something tossed into conversation and left there, like it wasn't important. She could still picture the store, a narrow place tucked along the main road, with a bell on the door that rang louder than it needed to. Shelves packed tight with canned goods, tools, jars of honey, things that hadn't changed much in decades. The kind of place where people noticed you the moment you stepped inside. Lenora had gone in her second day there. Needed coffee. Maybe something fresh. Something that didn't come out of a box. The man behind the counter had looked at her a little too long before speaking. Not unfriendly, just measuring. "You're the one renting up on Creekside, right?" he'd said. Lenora nodded, setting a small basket down on the counter. "That's right." He rang up her things slowly. No rush. "You out walking much?" he asked. "Trying to," she said. "Helps pass the time." He gave a small grunt, like he understood more than he was saying. "Plenty of trails around here," he added. "Some better than others." Lenora waited. People like him always circled their point before landing on it. Sure enough, he glanced up again. "You stay off the ridge trail?" There it was. Lenora raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why's that?" He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. "Storm took part of it out a few years back. Not maintained anymore. Gets tricky up near the top." She nodded once. That made sense. But he didn't stop there. "Old cabin up there," he added. "Been empty a long time." Lenora remembered the way he said it. Not like a fact. More like a habit. She'd almost left it at that. Almost. "What kind of cabin?" she asked. He hesitated just for a second, then leaned back slightly against the shelf behind him. "Nothing much. Logging days, maybe. Folks used to stay up there a long time ago." He paused. "No one does now." Lenora picked up her bag, ready to leave, but as she turned, someone else spoke from the corner. "Not exactly true." She glanced over. An older man sat by the window, hat tipped low over his eyes, a cup of something dark in his hands. He hadn't looked up yet. The store owner sighed under his breath. "Don't start, Earl." Earl didn't respond right away. He just took a slow sip, then set the cup down. "Just saying," he muttered. "People hear things up there." Lenora stopped. "What kind of things?" she asked. Earl finally looked at her. His eyes were pale, sharp in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "Movement," he said. "At night, mostly. Sometimes during the day if you're close enough." The store owner shook his head. "It's animals. Always has been." "Animals don't light fires," Earl replied quietly. Silence stretched between them. Lenora felt it then. That same stillness she felt now on the trail shone. She forced a small smile. Probably just stories. Earl held her gaze a moment longer than comfortable. "Maybe," he said. Then he looked away. That had been the end of it. No one tried to stop her. No one warned her outright. But the cabin had stayed in her mind after that. Not because of what they said. Because of how they said it. Like something they'd learned not to talk about too much. Lenora stepped forward again on the trail, her boot pressing into the earth with more care now. The memory faded as the present pulled her back. The ridge was closer, the cabin clearer. Bruno slowed again. His growl dipped lower, almost silent now, but still there, still constant. Lenora's chest tightened slightly. She hadn't believed in stories. Not then, not now. But standing here, halfway between where she'd been and wherever she was going, she couldn't ignore the feeling settling into her bones. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was, Bruno had felt it long before she did. She swallowed, her throat dry again, and took another step toward the ridge. The trail leveled out just enough to let her catch her balance. The trees thinned here, opening into a narrow stretch of land that curved along the cliffside. Beyond it, the drop fell away sharp and sudden, swallowed by layers of dark green forest below. The cabin sat at the far end, still, quiet, waiting. Lenora slowed without meaning to. Something about seeing it this close made the stories feel less like talk and more like something left behind, something people had chosen not to touch. Bruno moved half a step in front of her again, his body angled slightly, like he was guiding her path without breaking his focus. His growl had softened, but it hadn't disappeared. It lingered. Low. Constant. Lenora let her eyes move over the cabin again. The wood was old, no doubt about that. Sun-bleached and cracked, edges softened by years of wind and rain. One window faced the ridge, its glass clouded enough that it reflected more than it revealed. But now that she was closer, it didn't look abandoned. Not the way it should. She noticed it in the small things. The door, for one. It wasn't hanging loose or warped the way old doors usually did. It sat slightly open, just enough to shift with the faintest movement of air. Not broken. Not neglected. Just left that way. Lenora's brow tightened. She stepped forward again, boots crunching softly against gravel and old wood fragments scattered along the path. Her mind drifted again, uninvited this time. Back to the store. Back to the way people had spoken without saying much at all. She could still hear the bell over the door when she'd left that day. The way it rang sharp, then settled into silence behind her. She hadn't thought about the cabin right away. Not until later. That evening, sitting by the small window in the place she'd rented, a narrow upstairs room with faded curtains and a bed that creaked if she shifted too quickly, she'd looked out toward the hills. They stretched farther than she expected, layer after layer of blue-green ridges fading into the distance. Somewhere out there was the trail, and somewhere beyond that, the cabin. She hadn't planned to go, not at first. She'd told herself that much more than once. But the next morning, when she stepped outside with Bruno, the thought came back. Quiet, persistent, like a question she hadn't answered. He'd been restless that morning, pacing near the door, watching her in that way he had, head slightly tilted, waiting for her to decide something. "You want to walk?" she'd asked him. His tail had given one slow wag. That had been enough. Back in the present, Lenora let out a slow breath. The ridge narrowed again ahead of her, funneling toward the cabin. The ground shifted underfoot, more rock than soil now, with patches of lichen clinging to the surface. She moved carefully, each step deliberate. The silence hadn't lifted. If anything, it had settled deeper. No birds, no wind, just the faint sound of her own movement, and Bruno's low, steady presence beside her. Lenora glanced at him again. His ears twitched once, his head tilted slightly, then straightened again. Listening. "To what?" she whispered. No answer. Just that same fixed attention. She followed his gaze. To the left of the cabin now, where the structure met the cliff, a darker section of rock, shadowed, even in the open light. It didn't look like much, just stone and shade. But Bruno's focus hadn't wavered from it. Lenora felt a small chill work its way down her back. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the path ahead. The closer she got, the more details came into view. Scratches along the wood near the doorframe. Not deep, not recent, maybe, but not completely weathered away either. The ground near the entrance looked disturbed, not torn up, just used. Like something or someone had passed through more than once. Lenora stopped again, just outside the small clearing. The cabin loomed closer now, filling her view in a way it hadn't from below. It wasn't large, just one room from the looks of it. Maybe a small loft above, though it was hard to tell from this angle. Simple. Built for purpose, not comfort. She could almost imagine what it had been once. A place to rest, to wait out storms, to sleep after long days of work. And now, what? Her eyes drifted to the window again. For a second, she thought she saw something shift behind the glass. Not movement. More like a change in light. She blinked. Nothing. Just her reflection staring faintly back at her. "You're imagining things," she said quietly. Bruno didn't agree. His growl sharpened slightly. Lenora felt it more than heard it. A warning again, but not urgent. Not yet. She stepped forward into the clearing. The ground here was firmer, packed down in a way that didn't match the rest of the trail. Small stones pressed into the surface, flattened into place. Her boot landed softly. No echo, no hollow sound. Just solid ground. She took another step, then another, each one bringing her closer to the door. The air felt different here, warmer, not by much, but enough that she noticed. Lenora paused again. Her eyes lifted slowly, to the roofline, to the chimney. For a second, she thought it was just the angle, the light. But then she saw it. Faint, thin, barely there. A wisp of gray rising into the still air. Smoke. Her breath caught. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching it drift upward, dissolving into nothing. The cabin wasn't empty. It couldn't be. Bruno stepped forward beside her, muscles tightening again. His growl deepened. Lenora swallowed hard. The stories hadn't sounded like much before. Just fragments. Half-finished thoughts. But standing here now, they felt different, closer, real. She took one slow step toward the door and felt something inside her shift. Not fear. Not yet. Something else, something quieter, something that told her whatever was inside that cabin hadn't been alone for a long time. Lenora stood there for a moment, staring at the faint ribbon of smoke curling into the air. It moved slowly, almost lazily, like it had nowhere else to be. The sky above it was pale and still, offering no wind to carry it away. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. Bruno didn't respond. His body had gone rigid again, muscles tight beneath his coat. The low growl returned, steady and quiet, as if it had never really left. Lenora shifted her weight, her boots pressing into the packed earth of the clearing. The ground here felt different from the trail below, firmer, worn down in places, as though it had been walked on more often than it should have been. She glanced back over her shoulder. The path behind her had already begun to disappear into the trees. Branches leaned inward, shadows stretching across the narrow trail like they were closing it off. It hadn't been that dark when she came up, or maybe she hadn't noticed. She turned back toward the cabin. The silence pressed in again. No birds. No insects. Nothing but that thin line of smoke and Bruno's quiet warning. "All right," she said, more firmly now. "We didn't come this far to stand around guessing." Her voice sounded stronger than she felt. She took a step forward. Bruno moved with her, but slower this time. Careful. His head stayed low, eyes fixed on the cabin, then flicking briefly to the left, toward that same shadowed section where the wall met the cliff. Lenora noticed. She couldn't not notice. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. Just kept watching. She followed his gaze again, trying to see what he saw. The rock face there was darker, yes. The angle of the cliff blocked the light, casting a narrow strip of shadow that stretched along the side of the cabin. It looked deeper than it should have been, almost like an opening, though she couldn't make out any clear shape. Just shadow. Still, something about it held her attention longer than it should. She shook her head slightly, breaking the thought. Focus. One step at a time. Lenora moved forward again, closing the distance between herself and the cabin. The air shifted as she approached, not dramatically, but enough to notice. A faint warmth brushed against her face, carrying the smell of smoke and something else. Something clean. Not the damp, stale scent of a place left alone. This smelled used, lived in. Her chest tightened. "You smell that?" she asked, though she already knew Bruno had. His ears twitched once, then settled again. They reached the edge of the small clearing. Up close, the cabin felt larger, not in size but in presence. The wood creaked faintly, though there was no wind to move it. A slow, uneven sound, like something adjusting to weight. Lenora froze. There it was again. That sound, subtle, deliberate, not the random settling of old boards. Something inside had shifted. Bruno's growl sharpened instantly. Not louder, but tighter, focused. Lenora felt it in her spine. She stepped back without thinking, her heel brushing against a loose stone. It shifted under her weight, rolling just enough to make her catch herself. "Easy," she muttered, more to calm her own nerves than anything else. She forced herself to stand still. Listen. Nothing. The silence rushed back in, swallowing the sound like it had never been there. Lenora swallowed. "You're hearing things," she said under her breath. But she didn't believe it. Her eyes moved to the ground near the door. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Not old ones, worn into the dirt like the rest of the clearing. These were different. Clear. Defined. The edges still sharp, not softened by time or weather. They led straight to the door and stopped. Lenora felt a cold wave move through her chest. Someone had come up here. Recently. Her gaze followed the prints again, tracing them back a few steps. They came from the direction of the trail. Same path she had taken. Same narrow climb. She glanced behind her again. The trail was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It hadn't for a while. Bruno shifted closer to her leg, pressing just enough to remind her he was there. His growl dipped again, almost inaudible now, but it hadn't stopped. It was constant, like a thread holding everything together. Lenora reached down, resting her hand briefly against his neck. "You stay with me," she said quietly. His body leaned into her touch for just a second. Then he pulled forward again, attention snapping back to the cabin. Lenora followed. Another step. Closer now. Close enough to see the door clearly. It wasn't just ajar. It had been opened recently. The wood around the handle was darker, less faded than the rest of the surface. A faint mark where hands had touched it, over and over again. She could almost see it. Someone standing there, reaching out, pushing it open, going inside. Her breath slowed. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady but low. The sound didn't carry far. It felt swallowed almost immediately by the still air. No answer. She waited. Nothing. Just silence again. Lenora hesitated. Her instincts told her to turn around, to head back down the trail, back to the town, back to something familiar. But something else held her there. Not curiosity, not exactly. Something quieter. Something that had been building long before she set foot on that trail. She stepped forward again, now only a few feet from the door. Bruno moved in front of her, placing himself between her and the opening. His body blocked the entrance, his stance firm, protective. The growl deepened. For the first time, it carried something sharper, a warning that wasn't just about distance anymore. Lenora looked down at him, then back at the door. The opening was narrow, just enough to see darkness beyond it. No movement, no light. But the warmth still drifted out, faint and steady. Someone had been there. Maybe still was. Lenora's hand hovered near the edge of the door. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. The trail behind her. The silence around her. The cabin in front of her. And Bruno, whom still growling, still refusing to let his guard down. Lenora took a slow breath, then another, and finally, she made a decision. Lenora moved her hand forward and touched the edge of the door. The wood was warmer than she expected. Not hot, not fresh from flame, but not cold either. It held a kind of lingering heat, like something inside had been burning steadily for a while. She pulled her hand back instinctively. Bruno stepped closer, his body pressing slightly in front of her again, blocking the doorway. His growl deepened, not louder but heavier, more insistent. "I know," she whispered. But she didn't step away. Instead, she leaned slightly to the side, just enough to see past the narrow opening. Darkness. At first, that was all there was. The inside of the cabin didn't catch the light the way she expected. The doorway swallowed it, turning everything beyond into a dim, undefined space. Lenora blinked, letting her eyes adjust. Shapes began to form slowly. A table, a chair, something along the far wall, maybe a shelf. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. But the warmth was there, faint, steady, and the smell. She noticed it more clearly now. Wood smoke, yes, but also something else. Soap, cloth, a trace of something human that didn't belong in a place left empty for years. Lenora drew in a slow breath. "Hello?" she called again, a little louder this time. The sound seemed to hit the walls inside and fall flat. No echo, no response. Bruno didn't like that. His paws shifted slightly on the ground, claws pressing into the dirt. His body angled tighter, weight forward, as if ready to move at the smallest change. Lenora looked down at him. "Easy," she said softly. He didn't relax. She knew he wouldn't. Not yet. Lenora's gaze dropped again to the footprints near the door. They were clearer up close. Boot prints. Larger than hers. The pattern on the sole was distinct. Deep grooves pressed into the dirt, still sharp around the edges. Recent. Very recent. She followed them with her eyes. They came straight to the door and stopped. No prints leading away. No sign of anyone leaving. Lenora felt a tight pull in her chest. "So you're inside," she murmured. It wasn't a question. She straightened slowly, her eyes moving back to the doorway. The door itself creaked faintly as it shifted a fraction of an inch, moved by nothing she could see. That was enough to make her still completely. The sound was small, but in the silence around them, it felt loud, deliberate. Bruno's growl sharpened again. Lenora reached down and placed her hand firmly on his shoulder. "Stay," she said. This time he obeyed, not fully, but he held his position. Lenora took one careful step forward, then another. Each movement slow, measured. The ground near the doorway was worn smoother than the rest of the clearing. Small stones pressed flat into the dirt, edges dulled by repeated contact. She stepped over the threshold, just enough that her body crossed into the shadow. The temperature changed immediately. Cooler. Not cold, but different. The warmth she'd felt outside came from deeper within, from somewhere inside the cabin. Lenora paused there, half in, half out, letting her eyes adjust further. The shapes sharpened. A small stove sat against one wall, iron, old but not rusted through. A faint glow lingered inside it. Not flame, but the soft, dull red of embers that hadn't fully died out. Her breath caught. That wasn't imagination. Something had been burning. Recently. Her eyes moved across the room. The table held a tin cup. There was moisture along the rim, tiny droplets catching what little light filtered in through the doorway. Not dried. Not forgotten. Used. A blanket lay folded on a narrow bed in the corner. It wasn't dusty. The fabric held its shape, as though someone had smoothed it down not long ago. Lenora's pulse began to pick up, slow at first, then stronger. "Someone's here," she said quietly. Bruno shifted behind her, stepping just inside the doorway now. His body stayed pressed close to her side, but his attention snapped past her, deeper into the room. The growl returned, lower, focused. Lenora followed his line of sight, toward the far side of the cabin, toward the darker corner where the wall met the back. It was harder to see there. The light didn't reach as easily, but something about that space felt different. Not empty, occupied. She couldn't explain how she knew, she just did. Lenora stood still, listening, her ears strained for any sound, breathing, movement, anything. At first there was nothing. Then, a faint shift, so slight she almost missed it. Wood pressing under weight. A slow, controlled sound. Not the settling of an old structure. Something heavier. Something alive. Bruno reacted instantly. His growl deepened into something sharper, a warning that cut through the stillness like a blade. Lenora's heart thudded hard against her ribs. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on the shadowed corner, waiting. The silence stretched, long enough to make her question whether she'd imagined it. Then, another sound. Closer this time. A shift of fabric. A quiet intake of breath that didn't belong to her. Lenora's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She became aware of every detail at once. The weight of the air, the faint warmth behind her. Bruno's body tense and ready, and something else. Presence. Not distant, not hidden anymore. Close. Very close. Lenora swallowed, her throat dry. "Who's there?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake, but it came out softer than she expected. The question hung in the air, unanswered, for a moment. Then, movement. Not fast, not sudden. A shape separated itself from the darkness. Lenora's breath caught in her chest. The figure stepped forward just enough to be seen. Still. Silent. Watching. Bruno didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He held his ground, every muscle tight, his growl steady and unwavering. Lenora didn't step back, but she didn't step forward either. She stood there, caught between the doorway and the unknown. The cabin no longer felt abandoned, not even close. Something was inside, something that had been there before she arrived, and hadn't expected her to come. Lenora didn't breathe. Not at first. The figure stood just beyond the edge of the dim light, half hidden where the wall met the back of the cabin. It didn't move. Didn't speak, just watched. Bruno's growl deepened again. Lower now, heavier, a warning that held steady, like he had already made up his mind about what stood in front of them. Lenora felt it in her chest. That instinct, that pull to step back, to leave. But she didn't. Not yet. Her eyes adjusted slowly, pulling shape from shadow. A man. That was the first thing she understood. Not large, not imposing. Just there. He stood still, shoulders slightly angled, as though he had been resting against the wall before she stepped inside. His hands hung at his sides, relaxed but not careless. There was no rush in him, no sudden movement, just stillness. Lenora swallowed. "You've been here," she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. The man didn't answer right away. His face came into clearer view as her eyes adjusted further. Mid-40s, maybe older. Hard to tell in this light. His features were worn, not from age alone, but from something heavier. Time lived differently on a face like that. His gaze stayed on her. Not hostile, not welcoming. Just aware. Bruno shifted half a step forward, placing himself fully between Lenora and the man now. His body blocked her line slightly, his shoulders squared, head low, eyes locked. The growl didn't stop. Lenora reached down, resting her hand against his neck again. "Stay," she murmured. He didn't break position, but he held. The man finally moved. Not toward them, just enough to step out of the deeper shadow. The movement was slow, deliberate, measured, like he understood exactly how close the line was. "You shouldn't be up here," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges. Not threatening, but not soft either. Lenora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I could say the same," she replied. The man's eyes shifted briefly, to Bruno, then back to her. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Recognition. Not of her. Of the dog. He nodded once, almost to himself. "Good dog," he said quietly. Bruno didn't relax, but the growl softened, just a fraction. Lenora noticed. The man didn't step any closer. He kept the distance between them, a few feet, enough space to move, enough space to leave. Lenora glanced around the cabin again. Now that she wasn't alone in it, the details stood out more clearly. The stove. The faint glow of embers still alive beneath ash. A small stack of wood beside it, cut clean, not rotted. The table, scarred with use, not neglect. The cup, still damp. Nothing here spoke of abandonment. It spoke of someone staying, quietly, carefully, for a long time. "You live here," Lenora said. Again, not a question. The man didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. He just watched her. Bruno's growl dipped lower again, then steadied. Lenora felt the tension shift, slightly. Not gone, but different. She took a small step forward. Bruno immediately shifted with her, keeping himself between her and the man. The man noticed that too. He lifted his hands slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough to show them. Empty. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. Lenora studied him. "You don't look like someone who wants trouble," she replied. He gave the faintest hint of a smile. Not warm, just understanding. "Trouble usually finds people whether they want it or not," he said. Silence settled between them again. Thicker this time, but not as sharp. Lenora's shoulders eased just a fraction, not relaxed, but no longer braced. She glanced once more at the cabin around them, at the life tucked into it, at the quiet order of things. Then back at him. "People in town think this place is empty," she said. "They think a lot of things," he answered. That wasn't an argument. It was a fact. Lenora let that sit. Bruno shifted again. Not forward this time. Just enough to adjust his stance. The growl remained, but it had changed. Less warning. More watchfulness. Lenora felt it. That shift. Subtle. But real. She looked down at him, then back at the man. "You heard us coming," she said. He nodded once. "Long before you reached the ridge." Lenora's chest tightened slightly. "You didn't leave?" "No." "Why not?" The man's gaze drifted briefly to the doorway, to the trail beyond. Then back to her. "Because you came anyway," he said. That answer didn't explain anything. And yet, it did. Lenora exhaled slowly. She didn't feel like she was standing in danger anymore. Not exactly. But she didn't feel safe either. It was something else. Something in between. She shifted her weight slightly. "You have a name?" she asked. A pause. Then, "Elias." Lenora nodded once. "Lenora." Elias repeated it quietly, as if testing the sound. "Lenora." Bruno's ears twitched at the exchange, but he didn't growl louder. He didn't advance, he just watched, every movement, every breath. Lenora studied Elias for a moment longer. There was something in his posture. Not defensive, not aggressive, just still. Like a man who had learned not to move unless he needed to. Like someone who had been alone long enough to forget what normal movement looked like. Lenora felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Something else. Recognition. Faint. Unwelcome. But there. She looked away first. Back toward the doorway. The light outside. The path down. Then back at him. "You've been here a long time," she said. Elias didn't answer right away. But this time, he didn't avoid it either. Elias stood where he was, the faint glow from the stove brushing one side of his face. It showed more than the shadows had before. Lines across his forehead. A tiredness in his eyes that didn't come from a long day, but from something that had lasted years. He looked at Lenora for a moment longer. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "A long time." The words settled between them without weight, like they didn't need anything added to them. Lenora didn't ask how long. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Bruno shifted slightly, adjusting his stance again. The growl was still there, but quieter now, as if it had moved from warning into something else. Watchfulness, maybe. Awareness. Elias noticed. "You trust him," he said. Lenora glanced down at Bruno, her hand resting lightly against the dog's shoulder. "I do." Elias gave a small nod. "That's good," he said. "He knows things you don't." Lenora let out a quiet breath, almost a dry laugh. He's been trying to tell me that all the way up the trail." Elias's eyes flickered toward the door again, then back to her. "You shouldn't have come up here," he said. There was no sharpness in it, no accusation, just a statement. Lenora met his gaze. "People kept saying that," she replied. "In different ways. They weren't wrong." "Then why didn't you leave?" she asked. The question came out before she could stop it. Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped briefly, not to the floor, but somewhere past it, like he was looking through the wood, through the cabin, through the mountain itself. Then he lifted them again. "Because this is where I stay," he said simply. Lenora studied him. "That's not the same thing as answering the question." A faint shift passed through his expression, not irritation. Something closer to recognition. "You're not the kind of person who lets things go, are you?" he asked. Lenora's mouth tightened slightly. "I used to be," she said. The answer surprised even her. Elias didn't smile, but something in his posture eased, just enough to notice. Bruno took a small step to the side, not fully out of the way, but not blocking as firmly as before. His growl dropped lower again, almost a hum now, like something he was holding on to out of habit more than urgency. Lenora felt it. That change. It didn't make her relax, but it made her stay. She glanced again at the cabin around them, at the careful order of things, at the quiet signs of a life lived out of sight. "You've been up here all this time," she said, "and no one knows." Elias shook his head once. "Some people know enough," he said. "They just don't come looking." Lenora thought about the store, about Earl, about the way he had said those words. People hear things up there. "You hear them too?" she asked. Elias's gaze shifted slightly. "To what?" "The stories," she said. "The talk. The things people think they know." He gave a quiet exhale. I hear enough to know it keeps them away. Lenora nodded slowly. That what you want? Elias didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back once, deeper into the room, but not into shadow this time. Just enough to create space again. I didn't expect anyone today, he said. Lenora tilted her head slightly. Why today? Another pause. Elias looked at the stove, at the faint glow inside. Doesn't matter, he said. But it did. Lenora could feel it. There was something under the surface of his words, something he wasn't saying. She didn't push. Not yet. Bruno's ears flicked again. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room in a slow, deliberate motion. Then he looked back at Elias. No growl, not for a second. Then it returned. Soft. Controlled. Lenora noticed that too. She let her hand fall from Bruno's shoulder. You're not surprised I'm here, she said. Elias looked at her again. No. That's strange. Not really. Lenora waited. He didn't continue. Why? She asked. Elias's eyes held hers. Because people who end up here, he said, usually don't get here by accident. The words landed heavier than anything he'd said so far. Lenora felt them settle. Deep. Uncomfortable. She looked away first, back toward the door. The light outside had shifted slightly. Not darker, just different. Like time had passed without her noticing. Her chest tightened. I came for a walk, she said. Elias didn't argue. He didn't agree either. You came up a trail no one uses anymore, he said quietly. Lenora's jaw set. That doesn't mean anything. Elias held her gaze. It usually does. Silence filled the cabin again. But this time it didn't feel sharp. It felt still. Lenora became aware of the small things again. The faint crackle from the stove. The quiet rhythm of Bruno's breathing. The way the air held warmth in pockets, uneven and subtle. She looked back at Elias. You're not going to ask me to leave, she said. It wasn't a challenge, just a realization. Elias shook his head once. No. Why not? He took a breath. Slow, measured. Because you already came inside, he said. Lenora didn't understand that answer, but she didn't dismiss it either. Bruno shifted again. This time he stepped slightly back toward her, not retreating, just adjusting. His body no longer blocked her view of Elias. That was new. Lenora felt it clearly. A line had moved, not gone, but moved. She looked down at him, then back at Elias. You're not what I expected, she said. Elias tilted his head slightly. What were you expecting? Lenora thought about that. The stories, the warnings, the smoke, the footprints, the silence. I don't know, she admitted. Elias gave a faint nod. That's usually how it goes. Lenora let out a slow breath. She wasn't afraid the way she had been a few minutes ago, but she wasn't at ease either. She was somewhere in between. And that unsettled her more than fear would have shown. She took a small step forward. Bruno didn't stop her. He stayed close, but he let her move. Elias watched the shift. His eyes flicked briefly to the dog, then back to Lenora. He's deciding, Elias said quietly. Lenora frowned slightly. About what? Elias didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was softer. Whether I'm a problem. Lenora glanced at Bruno again. The dog's ears were forward, his posture steady, alert, but not aggressive, not the way he had been. She looked back at Elias. He hasn't made up his mind yet, she said. Elias nodded. No, he agreed. Not yet. And for the first time since she stepped inside that cabin, Lenora realized something clearly. This wasn't about whether she had found something dangerous. It was about understanding what she had found at all. And that was going to take more than a single question. Lenora stood there a moment longer, letting the quiet settle instead of rushing to fill it. The cabin didn't feel threatening anymore, not in the way it had when she first stepped inside. But it didn't feel simple either. Nothing about this place was simple. Elias moved first, not toward her, not away, just a step to the side, closer to the table. He rested one hand lightly against its edge, like he needed something solid there. Sit, if you want, he said. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a command. Just an option. Lenora glanced at the chair. It was worn, the wood smoothed by use, not time alone. She hesitated, then stepped forward slowly and lowered herself into it. The seat creaked softly under her weight. Bruno stayed standing, right beside her. Still watching Elias, still deciding. Lenora rested her hands in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. She didn't take her eyes off Elias. You said people who come here don't come by accident, she said. Elias nodded once. That's right. Lenora leaned back slightly. I didn't come looking for you, she said. I know, he replied. Then what did I come looking for? That question lingered in the air longer than the others. Elias didn't answer it. Instead, he looked past her for a moment, toward the doorway, toward the trail she had climbed. Then he spoke. Sometimes people don't know what they're looking for until they stop pretending they're not lost. Lenora let out a small breath. That sounds like something someone tells themselves when they don't want to explain the truth. Elias almost smiled. Maybe. The silence returned again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not tense, just open. Lenora shifted slightly in the chair. You've been up here all these years, she said. No one comes looking? Elias shook his head. They did, at first. Lenora's eyes narrowed slightly. And then they stopped. There was no bitterness in his voice. That stood out. Most people carried something when they talked about being left behind. Elias didn't. Or if he did, he had buried it deep. Why? She asked. Elias let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to her. Because they got what they needed, he said. Lenora didn't understand. From what? From me being gone. The words settled heavy. Lenora felt them, not because of what they meant, because of how simply he said them. She studied him more closely now, the way he stood, the way he spoke. There was no performance in it, no need to convince. He wasn't trying to make her believe anything. He was just stating what was. What happened? She asked quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He moved to the stove, crouching slightly to adjust a piece of wood inside. The embers shifted, glowing a little brighter before settling again. The small movement gave him time. Lenora watched him, waited. Finally, he stood again. "It was a long time ago," he said. "That doesn't mean it's gone," she replied. Elias glanced at her. There was something in his eyes now, something sharper. "You ever have something taken from you," he said, "that you didn't even realize you were holding on to until it was already gone?" Lenora didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elias saw it anyway. He nodded once. "Thought so." He leaned back slightly against the wall, crossing his arms. Not defensive, just settled. "I had a business," he said. "Construction. Small at first. Grew over time." Lenora listened. "It did well," he continued. "Too well, maybe. Got attention, contracts, people wanting in." His voice stayed even, controlled. "No problems at first. Then one job went bad." He paused. "Not because of the work," he added. "Because of the people involved." Lenora tilted her head slightly. "What kind of people?" Elias gave a faint shake of his head. "The kind that don't lose," he said. That told her enough. "Something went wrong," he continued. "Paperwork, money, blame." His eyes dropped briefly. Didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was who they decided it belonged to. Lenora felt her chest tighten. "You," she said. Elias nodded. "Me. And you couldn't fight it?" A small breath escaped him. "I tried." That was all he said. But it was enough. Lenora could fill in the rest. Lawyers, time, money running out, reputation shifting, doors closing one by one. "What about your family?" she asked. Elias's expression didn't change. "They needed something to believe," he said. "And what they were told made more sense than what I couldn't prove." Lenora looked away for a second, out toward the door, the trail, the distance. "They left," she said. "Yes." Not bitter, not angry, just final. Lenora felt something move inside her. Not sympathy, not pity, recognition. She looked back at him. "So you came up here," she said. Elias nodded. "At first I didn't plan to stay," he admitted. "Just needed somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew me." Lenora understood that part. Too well. "But then?" she asked. Elias glanced around the cabin, at the walls, at the stove, at the life he had built in this small, hidden space. "Then I realized," he said slowly, "that leaving was easier than explaining." Lenora let that sit. It made sense, more than she wanted it to. "And no one came after you?" she asked. "Not in a way that mattered," he replied. Lenora nodded slowly. Bruno shifted beside her. She looked down at him. His body had changed again. Still alert. Still aware. But the growl was gone. Completely. He stood quiet now, watching Elias with a steady, focused gaze. Lenora noticed. Elias noticed too. "That's something," he said. Lenora looked back at him. "He doesn't trust easy," she replied. "No," Elias said. "He doesn't." Another silence. But this one felt different from all the others. Less heavy, less uncertain. Lenora leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "You chose this," she said. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, then around the cabin, then back at her again. Finally, "Yes," he said. Lenora studied him. "You could leave," she said. "I could. But you don't." "No." "Why?" Elias's gaze softened slightly. Not weakness, just clarity. "Because out there," he said, nodding toward the door, "I was already gone." Lenora felt that one land. Deep. She didn't argue, didn't question it. She just sat there, letting the quiet settle again. And for the first time since she stepped inside that cabin, she wasn't trying to figure out if he was dangerous. She was trying to understand why he had disappeared, and why part of her understood it. Lenora sat there a moment longer, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her eyes no longer searching the room for danger. Instead, they stayed on Elias, not judging, not questioning, just seeing him. Bruno shifted beside her. She felt it before she looked. The change. Subtle, but real. She turned her head slightly. The dog stood steady, ears forward, eyes still locked on Elias. But the tension in his body had eased. Not gone. Never gone completely. But different now. Measured. Watching without warning. Lenora lowered her hand slowly and rested it against Bruno's neck. "You all right?" she murmured. Bruno didn't look at her, but he didn't growl either. That was enough. Elias noticed. "They know," he said quietly. Lenora glanced back at him. "Know what?" Elias tilted his head slightly, his eyes still on the dog. "When something's wrong," he said, "and when it isn't." Lenora let that settle. She looked down at Bruno again. He wasn't relaxed, but he wasn't ready to act either. He had made a decision, not fully, but enough. Lenora straightened slightly in the chair. The cabin felt smaller now. Not because of the space, because of what filled it. Not fear, not danger, just truth. She let out a slow breath. "This place," she said, looking around, "it's not hiding you." Elias didn't respond right away. "No," he said finally. "It's just where I am." Lenora nodded. She understood that difference, more than she expected to. She stood slowly, the chair creaking under her as she pushed herself up. Bruno moved with her, staying close at her side. Still alert, still watching, but no longer blocking her path. Lenora took a step toward the center of the room, then another. She wasn't careful in the same way she had been before, still aware, but not afraid. Elias didn't move. He stayed where he was, giving her space, letting her walk, letting her see. Lenora stopped near the table. Her fingers brushed the edge lightly. The wood was smooth in places, worn by use. She glanced at the cup again, then at the stove, then at the blanket. Each piece of the room held a quiet kind of care. Not survival, not desperation, choice. "You built this," she said. Elias gave a small nod. "Piece by piece." Lenora looked back at him. "You could have gone somewhere else," she said. "Started over." Elias met her gaze. "This is starting over," he replied. Lenora didn't argue. She didn't agree either. She just stood there, thinking. Bruno moved a step forward, not toward Elias, just into the space between them. He stopped, looked at Elias, and then he sat. Lenora blinked. That was new. Bruno never sat in situations like this, not unless he had decided something. She looked down at him, then back at Elias. Elias noticed too. A faint shift passed through his expression, something softer. "He's made up his mind," Elias said. Lenora felt her chest tighten slightly. "About you?" she asked. Elias nodded once. "About whether I'm worth worrying about." Lenora let out a quiet breath. Bruno remained still, calm, watchful, but no longer warning. That mattered, more than anything else that had happened since she stepped inside. Lenora turned her head slightly, glancing toward the doorway. The light outside had changed again. Lower now. Late afternoon slipping toward evening. Time had passed. More than she realized. She looked back at Elias. "I should go," she said. The words came naturally. Not out of fear, not out of urgency. Just right. Elias nodded. "I figured you would." Lenora studied him for a moment. "You're not worried I'll tell someone?" she asked. Elias gave a small shake of his head. "No." "Why not?" He looked at her. Really looked this time. "Because you won't," he said. Lenora didn't respond right away. She didn't know how he could be so certain, but she also didn't feel the need to argue. Bruno stood as she stepped toward the door. He stayed close, not pressing, not guarding, just with her. Lenora paused at the threshold, the warmth of the cabin behind her, the cooler air outside waiting. She glanced back once. Elias hadn't moved. He stood where he had been, steady, quiet, part of the room like everything else. Not hidden, not revealed. Just there. Lenora nodded slightly. Not a goodbye. Not exactly. Something simpler. Then she stepped out. The air outside felt different now, sharper, lighter. She took a breath and let it out slowly. Bruno followed, stopping beside her on the small clearing. He turned his head once, back toward the cabin. Not growling, not tense, just looking. Then he turned back to her. "Ready." Lenora looked down the trail. The path stretched ahead, winding back through the trees, down toward the town she had come from, the place she had left behind. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate either. She started walking, and this time, Bruno didn't look back. Lenora noticed it immediately. All the way up the ridge he had paused, turned, listened. His body had carried that tension like a thread pulled tight from the cabin down through the trees. But now, he moved forward, steady, quiet, as if something behind them no longer needed watching. Lenora followed the trail down, one careful step at a time. The slope felt steeper going back. Loose gravel shifted under her boots, and she leaned slightly toward the rock wall to keep her balance. The air had changed. Not warmer, not colder, just clearer. She drew in a slow breath, filling her lungs. The scent of pine returned. The damp earth, the faint sweetness of crushed needles underfoot. All the things she hadn't noticed on the way up. Her shoulders eased. Not completely, but enough. Bruno walked beside her, close but not pressed in. His ears flicked now and then, catching sounds deeper in the woods, branches moving, distant birds returning to their quiet patterns. Normal sounds. Lenora let out a small breath. "Feels different," she said. Bruno didn't answer, of course, but his pace stayed even. They reached the first bend in the trail, where the ridge began to disappear behind the trees. Lenora slowed, just for a moment. She turned her head slightly, looking back through the narrow break in the branches. The cabin wasn't visible anymore. Not from here. It had already folded itself back into the mountain, hidden the way it had always been. Lenora stood there a second longer. Then she nodded once, to herself, and turned away. They continued down. The path widened gradually, the ground softening again beneath her boots. Small patches of moss clung to the edges, and the light filtered differently through the trees now. Lower, warmer. Time had moved forward. She hadn't realized how long she'd been up there. Bruno trotted a few steps ahead, then slowed to match her pace. He didn't wander far, didn't circle back the way he usually did. He stayed close. Lenora noticed that too. "You staying with me now?" she murmured. His tail gave a small, easy sway. Not excitement, just presence. They walked the rest of the trail in quiet. No more strange sounds. No more stillness pressing in. Just the mountain, settling back into itself. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sky had softened into late afternoon. A faint breeze moved through the streets, carrying the familiar smell of wood smoke and distant cooking. Life, simple, ordinary. Lenora paused at the edge of the road, looking toward the small cluster of buildings ahead. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt different. Bruno stopped beside her, glancing up briefly. She rested her hand on his head. "Let's go," she said. They walked into town together. The general store sat where it always had, its front window catching the last light of the day. A couple of trucks were parked outside. Someone stood near the entrance, talking, their voices low and familiar. Lenora didn't stop. She didn't go in. Not today. She kept walking past, Bruno at her side. No one called out. No one asked where she'd been, and she didn't offer it. Back at the small place she had rented, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room felt the same, quiet, a little worn, but hers for now. She set her bag down by the chair. Bruno moved to his usual spot near the window and lay down with a soft exhale. Lenora watched him for a moment. Then she crossed the room and opened the window. Fresh air moved in, brushing against her face. She stood there, looking out at the trees beyond the edge of town. The ridge wasn't visible from here, but she knew where it was, knew what stood up there, and who. She didn't feel the need to go back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. She turned away from the window and sat down in the chair, letting her hands rest quietly in her lap. Her thoughts moved slowly, not chasing answers, not pulling at questions, just settling. Later, as the light faded and the first shadows of evening stretched across the floor, she rose again and made a simple meal. Nothing special, nothing complicated. She ate in silence, Bruno nearby, the the soft sound of his breathing filling the room. Afterward, she stepped outside once more. The air had cooled. The sky above the mountains had shifted into deep blues and fading gold. She stood there for a while, just watching, not thinking, not planning, just being. Days passed, then a week. Lenora found her rhythm in the town without forcing it. Morning walks with Bruno, small errands, quiet conversations when she felt like having them, silence when she didn't. She didn't return to the ridge. She didn't speak about the cabin, and no one asked. One afternoon, as she and Bruno walked along the edge of the road, they reached the start of the trail again. The same narrow path, the same worn ground leading upward. Lenora stopped. Bruno paused beside her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The trees stood still. The trail waited. Lenora looked up. Not all the way to the top, just enough to see the beginning of the climb. Bruno's ears flicked once. He looked up too. No growl, no tension, just quiet attention. Lenora let out a slow breath. She rested her hand gently on his back. "We don't need to go up there," she said. Bruno didn't move, but he didn't pull forward either. He simply stood with her. Lenora gave a small nod, then turned away. They walked on, the trail behind them, the town ahead, and something inside her. Steady now. Clear. Sometimes people are pushed out of their lives without being asked. Other times, they step away on their own. But either way, what matters is what you choose to hold on to and what you decide to leave behind. Lenora kept walking, and this time, she didn't feel like she had lost anything at all.
Lenora paused at the bend where the trail dipped out of sight, her hand resting lightly on Bruno Park. He didn't pull forward, didn't look behind them, just stood there, steady, like he had already decided what mattered and what didn't. She talked about the cabin, about the man who never ran, about the light that had quietly slipped out of the world without anyone stop it. For a long time, she believed losing everything meant being left behind. But somewhere between that gleam and the silence inside that room, she realized something else. Some people aren't forgotten. They just no longer willing to be seen the way the world insists. Bruno had known it first. He didn't chase fear. He didn't follow stories. He stayed until he understood. Lenora gave him a shot back, then turned away from the ridge for good. And as he walked down, lighter than she had in years, she wondered, if being pushed out of life hurts this much, what does it feel like to finally choose your own way out?